going to call the meeting to order. It's 8:30 on Tuesday, August the 8th. And we'll call the meeting to order. Anybody who has your cell phone, please turn the cell phone off if you would. And we will start this workshop agenda. A is to discussion and consideration of matters regarding the fiscal year 2017-18 budget preparation, including but not limited to major funds revenue and expenditures and other items needing council direction.
Tina, you're on.
All right. Okay, well, we're going to get started this morning by just quickly going through our budget process and calendar, just as a reminder for where we start out in April. We start out there with training for the departments, our budget staff. Oh, sorry. I'm looking at my screen. Y'all can't see it. So we started in April with training for the departments and divisions. Our budget staff conducts that training, and we also hand out the revenue packets where we ask our department directors and managers to estimate their revenue for the upcoming year. Then in May, we hand out our expenditure packets where we ask our directors to project their expenditures and justify what those expenditures are for the coming year. We hand out the salary and benefit reports, the targets, and things like that, and they get those back to us. And then in June, we sit down and review all the information with the city manager's office. Our budget review team includes the budget staff, myself, and of course CMO. And then we also begin sending out council memos in June to get you started on information that we see upcoming in the upcoming budget year. In July, we continue those council memos on each Friday to continue to feed you information so that you're aware of everything that we're expecting and what's going on. And then in August, of course, we start our workshops, this being the first of our budget workshops for this year. And we also begin our public hearings. On the 15th, we'll have our first public hearing where we can allow the citizens to come and discuss our proposed budget and tax rate. And it's in September. We continue those public hearings to allow for more public discussion. And then, of course, we adopt the budget and the tax rate by ordinance. So that's our process. Do y'all have any questions on how all of that works? We can move on. Okay. So today we are going to discuss the major funds, revenue and expenditures. Our major funds this year are the state office building, the airport, solid waste, stormwater, water, wastewater, civic events, Fort Concho, hotel occupancy tax, and development corporation. We have information on all of those funds. We won't spend too much time on state office building, stormwater, or wastewater just because there's not a whole lot going on there, but we certainly have that information available should you have any questions for us on that. So we'll start out here with the airport fund. There were not a lot of changes this year with the airport fund. And let me just say here that we do have the department directors and managers here should you have any specific questions related to their operations or anything like that. But again, the airport fund, not too many changes. They do have some additional lease revenue this year. So that increased their income a little bit, their revenue, and they also had a little bit of additional revenue for concessions. And they used that to redouble their maintenance schedules and to provide for more operational capacity out at the airport. Next, we have the solid waste fund. Again, not a whole lot of change there with the solid waste fund. They do budget revenue over expenditures in the solid waste fund in an effort to build their fund balance because they do expect to need a permit in the future. I think they're trying to build that fund balance up over a period of 8 years to allow them to build up the capacity to purchase that permit in the future. The water fund, here we have, again, budgeted revenue over expenditures in line with the water rate study. So we're trying to grow that fund balance so that they have the capacity to operate in a manner that is efficient and effective. They do have an increase as well in their expenditure budget. That is largely due to debt service payments for the Ford Ranch. The Civic Events Fund, we did make a change this year with Civic Events Fund. That's Fund 410. Historically, we have accounted for civic events and hotel occupancy tax in the same fund. We've decided that for accounting purposes and to make it more transparent that we're going to pull out the hotel occupancy tax into its own special revenue fund so that all hotel occupancy tax will now go into Fund 605 And then from there, it will go out to the different stakeholders that we have, as well as Civic Events Fund. So that would just be an income stream, a revenue into Civic Events Fund from the Hotel Occupancy Tax Fund. Again, Hotel Occupancy Tax Fund is one of our major funds, so we'll see that in just a moment as well. Fort Concho, not a lot of changes in Fort Concho Fund, but it is one of our major funds, so we do put it up here and allow you to see the activity that's happening there this coming year. Again, Hotel Occupancy Tax Fund, this is where we've moved all of our, you'll see our revenue is the hotel occupancy tax that we have budgeted for revenue for next year, and then the expenditures would just be, again, those external partners and the transfers to other funds, which would be our Civic Events Fund, Fort Concho, Texas Bank Sports Complex, those partners that we have there. You do see that we have revenue budgeted under expenditures this fund. We do expect to draw down fund balance this year for this fund. We have met with city manager's office and our external stakeholders, and we have built up that fund balance in the past because we had some good years. We're looking forward to hopefully having another good year, but in the event that we do not, then we do expect to possibly draw down that fund balance a little bit to fund those operations. And we will be meeting with those stakeholders and city manager's office again in March to discuss that and to see where we are and make sure we keep on track with our plans for that fund. Development Corporation, they are budgeting their revenue down this year. You know, the Development Corporation is funded by the sales tax, and so they're being cautiously optimistic and budgeting down a little bit. That is not what we are budgeting for the general fund, but they feel like that's achievable, and so, of course, their expenditures are budgeted down in correlation with that. And so that's all of the major funds that we have to discuss. And we'd be happy to go back through them a little more slowly, talk to department directors and managers, whatever your appetite would be for discussion with those.
Or I'm not sure whom. I assume everyone goes through as a part of the process to look at things that may need to be added or increased, things that may no longer need to be done, that may be decreased. Just from a process standpoint, I guess when and how is that done to be sure that we're being as wise as possible with the tax money we receive?
Sure. So let me go back to your budget calendar here. So that would occur in April and May when we send out the revenue packets and the expenditure packets. As far as tax is concerned, though, we're not discussing that today. That would be our discussion when we discuss the general fund in 2 weeks. We're happy to discuss it now and answer any questions you have, of course. But these are more of our enterprise funds that are expected to operate on their own revenue streams. That's the intent, anyway.
Sure, okay. Well, I was really more concerned about process of everybody saying, okay, we know we have this expenditure, we can match up this revenue, but we may need to decrease here, we don't need to do this anymore, but you're saying that happens in the April and May time frame?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Tom, you also look at those items during the city manager review period. You know, so even though directors may look at it and determine, okay, these are the areas where we feel we can come up, reduce our expenditures. We actually look at it a little bit more deeply during our city manager reviews as well to question those items.
And in addition, our budget staff really hones in on, once we receive those estimates, we review that on a very regular basis. After we close every month, we go in and see, you know, what's the trend this year? What do we expect to happen next year? If we feel like we should increase or decrease our revenue or expenditure based on that information, then we get with the department director or manager and discuss that with them. They may have information that we're not aware of. We may have information that they're not aware of. And so we're very closely in tune with what their needs are and trying to budget accordingly. We also do have a process for target increase requests. And so the departments are, whenever we hand out expenditure packets, if they feel like they need more money in their budget for some reason, then there's a form that they can fill out, and they let us know what those needs are, and we discuss those as well in our budget review process with the city manager's office.
So we always start with the last year's numbers and use that as the basis for what we're planning for the next year.
For the most part.
So if we go through this one area at a time, starting with the airport fund, talk through the increase opportunity in leases and concessions, the $60,000. Tell me about that.
Can I get Lou up here to talk about your new lease? Okay.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
In concessions, we have one additional hangar that we leased out this year, the large, what we call the AMCOM South hangar, that we leased on a month-to-month basis, and that was the increase in rent for this coming year.
And that's the only thing where you see an opportunity for increased revenue.
At the moment, yes.
And how about concessions? Any opportunity for increased concessions?
We already included the allotted amount, what we estimate for next year.
Was that equal to last year's or an increase in last
I
year's?
believe
There was an increase of
It was a little bit-
$20,000 for concessions from
Correct.
last year.
And that's based on what?
trends from this year, especially rental cars revenue.
Okay, and there's no other opportunity for increased in revenue?
Not at the moment.
In concessions, nothing? Same
No.
amount of vending machines?
Yes.
No new vending machines? What's the profitability on vending machines?
We're running around a 20% return on investment, but we need to recover our investment that we made this year for those vending machines,
And those were what?
around $5,000.
And that was what?
Two candy machines.
And we lease those or we buy those?
We bought them.
Lou, can you tell us what's included in your concessions revenue? Is that just vending machines, or is there something else as well?
We have just primarily rental cars in concessions, car rentals, and we also have the two restaurants.
And those are leases, the restaurants are leases? And the
Correct.
car companies give us what? The rental companies?
We have 5 rental companies: Avis, Hertz, Budget, and Thrifty and Dollar.
And they pay us a lease?
Yes, it's a concession lease. We have a minimum guarantee plus or a percentage, whichever is greater.
Okay. And the other is what?
The two restaurants, what used to be Above the Clouds, and that hasn't opened yet, but it'll reopen pretty soon, and Mathis Field Cafe.
And those are leases?
Those are leases. Again, those are leases as concessions, so there's a minimum guarantee or a percentage of revenue, whichever is greater.
Is there any risk in the revenue forecast here?
No, I'm very conservative on that.
And what would you say the biggest opportunity is over and above what you have budgeted?
Land leases in the future, especially non-aeronautical.
All right, on personnel, you have an increase of 29,000, and tell me about that, as well as the operations and maintenance, I'm assuming is a 53.
On personnel, we use those numbers that come from HR, so we stick with those numbers. And on maintenance, we estimate what we're going to have for next year, and that it's very detailed in the, does council have the detail package?
No.
No. I've been very detailed. I was wondering, can council receive this so they can see all the detail that I have for?
The personnel increases, you are funding a position that you've held open because of lost revenue in the past, is that right?
Those positions have held open, but the positions has always been there. We never deleted those positions.
Okay,
So-
but that's the increase, is that when he lost a key tenant in the past, he defunded a couple of positions and did not refill them when they came open. And so that is, maintenance has been suffering as a result. And so I think this year you're going to refill one of those positions. Is that correct? That's the personnel increase you asked about.
Okay.
You'll also see some personnel increase probably in all of our funds due to increased health insurance premiums and benefits.
But those haven't been voted on, right? So they're
They're
budgeted but not voted on?
They were voted on in the prior year, so they increased last year. They increased our targets for next year.
Okay, but I thought at last meeting, council meeting, or you presented to us some additional increases in costs for healthcare this
Right,
year.
and so if we decided to do that, that would be an increase to our budget for next year.
So those are not inclusive in this existing
That's correct.
budget that we
That's
have.
correct.
So these are only the ones that have already been prior approved.
Yes, ma'am.
And so when we fill the personnel positions, those positions are based off of actually making knowing that the revenue forecasted will be produced, or are you planning on hiring them before the revenue trend?
We've hired one this year, but we already received that revenue, so we're estimating to have the revenue for next year.
So for 2017 and 18.
Correct.
Right. All right.
Can you talk about anything that you eliminated from your budget that you is not included, that we don't see the detail here, but anything that was eliminated that was not necessary or
There's a
needed?
lot of routine maintenance that we've had to cut back, especially on the airfield, but we're estimating to cover those as revenue increases too, especially with those open positions that we have to.
And the maintenance that was not done is what? Repeat that again.
Airfield maintenance. We've cut down on the frequency of mowing on the airfield, and we addressed the major issues with the asphalt.
The drought probably helped with that, didn't it?
A little bit, but the
Yeah.
rain has not helped.
So Lou, does that become a safety issue for the airlines?
No, sir. Anything that is safety related, we go ahead and.
You have to do.
We have to do it,
Okay.
according to the FAA regulations.
Lou, there's no clever way to say this. You and the deputy director, Mitch, run mowers, run tractors, and do some of that mowing, don't
Both
you?
of us fill in wherever needed at the airport, in any position.
So sometimes Lou comes to meetings, he's wearing jeans and he's covered with grass clippings or.
I love when a boss shows everybody that you can do the work too. Thank you for that.
Sure.
There's no other opportunity for revenue here?
Unless something appears right now, no, I'm being conservative on the revenue. Again, if the finance department can provide the detail to council, I think this will explain everything for you.
The the airport lease rates are governed by
Schedule
by
of
standard
rates.
rates and charges. We update that periodically, don't we, Lou?
Yes, this year will be another year that we have to.
So we'll have this upcoming year at existing rates and charges, and during that year, we'll be updating for the new.
The rates and charges for the next 3 years, yes.
And when you talk about standard rates and charges, define that.
We establish all our rates and charges for every category that we have, so all the tenants know what their rates will be, and it's something that the FAA requires too, so we have to publish those.
Do you
And
have
City Council votes on those.
benchmarks against which you
We
compare?
do, sir. We compare against other airports, specifically for T hangars.
All of those planes that are sitting out there on the tarmac, what do we charge American Airlines for all of those planes?
Right now, it's $192 per month per plane. And we conservatively estimate the amount of aircraft we have for next year.
Is that included in the other section of revenue? Is that what
It's
that is?
included in the,
Is that leases?
yeah, it's in the leases section.
Okay.
Again, once you receive this, you'll see a complete detail. I've been very detailed in our revenue and our expenditures too.
Is there any reason to believe those planes will be going away?
There might be, but I've been conservative on the number too.
So they have a conversation with you or notification with you if in fact they're going to take planes off the tarmac and haul them away? Or
Yes.
they notify you ahead of time when the planes are coming?
Well, not when they're coming, just if they're using them, and we estimate a few to go back to service in the next year or two. It takes some time to put them back into service.
And who services those planes?
It's American Airlines maintenance facility out of Abilene.
So they come down here.
They've moved some mechanics to San Angelo, and they travel each day too.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
On solid waste, is that the next one?
Yes, ma'am.
So This is 215,000 or almost 216,000 less than last year in total budget. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Shane's
Okay.
going to come and talk to you about that
Good.
change.
That's the decrease in the net revenue over expense.
It's,
It's
yeah,
moved up into contingencies, I believe.
yes, we put, every year we budget revenue over expense, which is a little bit, it's different, a little bit different than it was last year, as we put some in contingencies in case, when we start looking at any of the permitting or any of the things that we have to do out at the landfill, any of the environmental issues that we have to deal with out there at the landfill, working with Republic to do those. But we do every year, we budget revenue over expense, so we intentionally are building up our fund balance. So within the next 8 years or so, we're going to have to look at permitting either the new land, or we're going to have to look at expanding our existing permit vertically. And so with that, we're setting the monies back now so we can pay for that process in the future. So we're building a fund balance to be able to do that as we move into the future.
And what's your fund balance now?
I'd have to, do you have the blue book, Tina?
Yes, I do. One moment.
Vertically.
Depending on it, depending on how we tackle it, it could be anywhere from $2 to $4 million, and that's depending on looking at a new permit or whether we do a permit expansion. If there's anybody that that challenges the permit, anything like that. If we have a lot of legal fees associated with it, that price goes up really, really quick.
Now, would that be for just dumping to raise the level of the landfill? Is that what you're?
We can do a permit modification to increase the vertical height of the landfill, the existing landfill, as the permit sets now, or we have the 320 acres to the north, to where we can either modify our existing permit to expand the landfill into that area, or we can create a new permit for that landfill area there. We have several options that we can look at as we move forward. We just, as we move forward, depending on what the state legislature and even some of the federal laws we're looking at the time will depend on what our best action or best move forward will be at that time, based on kind of where we are within the, our previous federal administration. We were becoming very tight and, very more restricted in our abilities and what we were able to do. And with the new administration, we're starting to see or hear talk of some of that relaxing. And so there may be different options for us to look at as we move forward into our next need for expansion out at the landfill.
Your capital increase is 250,000 over the previous year. Talk about that.
Again, that's just going into contingencies in case there are things that come up out at the landfill that we need to address. Looking as we look into the future, whether we need to look at some fencing issues or things like that as we're moving forward, looking into the new area and some of the issues that we're working through right now.
So $250,000 increase is a large increase. What is the number one large increase in capital expenditures? Because that's a huge jump.
It is. It's a huge jump, and again, it's going back as we're looking into some of the things that we're looking at right now that you've asked us to look at.
Okay.
We set some of those funds aside just in case that there's something that we need to do, whether that's in a professional service or if that's in some other area. We have placed that money back into contingencies for that.
And if the landfill did not see a need to use those funds in this coming fiscal year, then that would, of course, still fall to fund balance and would aid them in the future with their permitting.
Okay.
And to answer your question on their current fund balance, they're budgeted for this current year to have an ending fund balance of just over $2.5 million.
Shane, in the past, we were saving up for more than just that permitting exercise. Have we achieved all those other objectives? Is that the main thing now?
The main thing currently is the future permitting is what we're looking at. The majority of the other objectives have been covered in the contract. A lot of the other ones have been covered in the contract that we have now.
So the new contract cleaned up some of that old.
It cleaned up a lot of it, and of course, prior to the new contract and everything, we were sitting at a negative $2.6 million fund balance. So we've not only cleaned that up, but a lot of the other liabilities that we had as well too.
Does the cost of that permit go up over time each year, or?
Not necessarily. It's based on the current regulations that are in place at the time, and the amount of legal work and preparation that has to go into it. There's all the different studies, you know, that you have to do, all the testing and the water testing, the soil testing and everything that goes into it, all the engineering studies that go into it. Now, as those prices increase, of course, the cost goes up, but not necessarily the permitting itself.
The permit itself. So is there any wisdom in going through that process and getting it permitted prior to you actually needing it, or is that just a waste of time and money to do that?
You have to start placing material in that landfill within 24 months of receiving a permit. So it's not like we can go out and get a permit 8 years or 10 years early, unless we do modify our existing permit to expand our existing permit, and then we're okay. But if we go out and we create a new permit on the new land, and then within 24 months we have to start using that new landfill.
Okay.
What is the height restriction? Because we talk about airspace, and we have X amount of airspace available to us under existing permit, but we have opportunity to go over and above that height for additional air space, aerial expansion.
Yes.
So how close are we to the existing height under existing permit?
Currently under the field space, other than the existing cell that we're working in right now, we're very close to our height restriction on all the areas that have been filled to this point. Of course, we would have to do if we want to continue to see a vertical increase, we would have to do a permit modification, which basically goes through a lot of the same processes. It's not as complicated as starting a new permit, but a lot of the same processes where, you know, we have to allow for public feedback and the whole 9 yards to do a vertical expansion. But it's doable, and it's whatever. Well, I mean, there is a certain point where you hit a peak, and I'm not sure exactly how high that is out there right now, but it's basically going to be left up to council as to how high y'all want to see a mountain out to the northeast end of town. So
Much wiser to use existing opportunity than create new expense. And
yes, correct.
Years terms to see how far along we can go until we hit that limit?
We can, and we're actually working through a lot of those airspace numbers kind of right now as to what's actually out there and what's available within not only the existing permit, what say a 10-foot increase or a 20-foot increase with our existing permit mod would be, and then also you know, looking at available airspace as we move into the future, into the new site. We've kind of projected out in years that's roughly, you know, the new site, the 320 acres would give us approximately an additional 100 years of airspace. But we have it in years, but we don't necessarily have it in exact capacity.
so are there any risks or opportunities in your revenue side?
We're staying pretty steady right now within our revenue, and of course, revenue is based on how many citizens we have and how much money is collected from that end of it, but also the majority of our revenue comes from, you know, when it comes across the scales out at the landfill. And so, as we're if we see a large boom like we did 3 or 4 years ago in the oil field, and all of a sudden we started seeing a lot more trash and debris coming from out west of us, bringing it into our landfill, our tonnage goes way up, and we can see an increase there. We have seen, since then, we've started seeing a decline, and so we have based our revenues on a fairly conservative number as to what we can expect from a tonnage going across our scales out at the landfill. And we budget, you know, from the collection side of it, on that side of it, from the billing and collection side, That stays fairly flat every year. We don't see a huge influx one way or the other. It stays fairly flat. The biggest increase or decrease that we see is based off tonnage at the landfill.
Okay.
Track that we put in place in April, has the every other week bulk hurt or helped the fees out on the scales? Have you seen a trend? Are we collecting more or less?
From the tonnage standpoint,
bulk
going in there,
pickup,
from
yeah.
the bulk,
Pickup, has it decreased in people going out there, going across the scales? Secondary to-
we've started seeing a decrease in the free dumping, in the take the water bill once a month out to landfill. We've started seeing those numbers, those tonnage numbers are starting to finally decline, which they had for quite some time been increasing very steadily over time, and so we're starting to see somewhat of a decrease there from the free dumping aspect of it. We're still, and of course, a lot of it had to do with the storm debris and some of those other things. Ever since we've implemented it, it's been very well and very heavily utilized since we've implemented the every other week bulk pickup so far. We haven't really started to see a huge decline in those numbers yet. But again, as we start getting into, this time of month where grass is getting harder and harder to grow, we'll probably start seeing less of those until we get into the October, November, when we see a huge increase in the leaves. Now, granted, that's not heavy. Leaves aren't necessarily real heavy, but we will see an increase in that utilization of that service when we get into the fall and winter months.
Shane, educate me, please. Looking at the Blue Book, I have a question on several of the line items. Under revenue, could you share with me what landfill host fees are? And under expenditures, contract services and professional services, what are those?
Yes.
The host fees or the tipping fees, that's when you go across the scales out at the landfill. There's a certain dollar amount that comes back to the city from that, and that's the revenue based off of the host fees or the tipping fees out there.
Oh, okay.
And then
Contract services?
on the contract services, we have a third-party engineering firm that we keep that we have a contract with that reviews a lot of the documentations when we do a lot of the permit modifications. All of our annual inspections, the emissions inventories, a lot of those types of things, they review those for us to make sure that that's all correct before we submit all that to the state.
Oh, okay. And then professional services? How
Well,
does that
I'm
differ?
sorry, that was actually professional services, is what I just described there. Contract services, I'm trying to think which one.
It's budgeted for 210,000 for
Oh, that's the Citizens Free Dumping program.
the what?
The Citizens Free Dumping program, the once a month, when you take your water bill out there once a month, that's where we budget those funds, is in that line item.
But it's an expenditure.
Yes,
So-
we have to, anything over 6,000 tons that is taken out there under that program, anything above and beyond, the city is responsible for those costs.
Okay.
So we pay standard for anything above the 6,000. The first 6,000 tons are at no cost to the city.
Oh, okay.
Anything above the 6,000 tons, which for the last 2 years we have exceeded significantly. It's been such a well-utilized program that anything above that, we pay regular gate rate for every ton that comes in after that.
The city is responsible.
The city is responsible, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Because you have to account for all dumping.
Yes, everything that goes out there goes across the scales, and so it's all weighed and it's all capacity.
So I know that as far as the bulk pickup, to have that opportunity for citizens to actually put their bulk items out in front of their yard actually helps that expenditure.
It does. It will. Having the opportunity for them to be able to get rid of it in front of their home and have it being picked up as part of their service will help that, hopefully. And we've started to see a decline in that number. And so we hope that trend continues, because that will free up those dollars out of this fund.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Shane. Bill Riley, he's up next.
Bill, could you come up and talk with us about the water fund, please?
All right, let's talk about the sales under revenue, almost $1.6 million increase over the previous year.
This is in line, I'm Allison Struby, the Assistant Director of Water Utilities. This is in line with the Raftellus rate plan. They are the consultants who did the rate plan a couple years back. We had them update last year's actual revenues and usage numbers, and so this is the new projections based on rates for the remaining of 2017 and new rates to go into effect 2018.
Is that usage the same, it's just an increase in rate, or is there a combination of increase in sales and an increase in rate?
Not an increase in usage, because we're not seeing that. Based on, we're being conservative in the usage numbers. Last year, as it was a rainy year, we did see a decline in our, we did not meet our revenue as we had, or what we had budgeted last year based off that usage. So
I want to just be clear, 2016 and 17 is actual numbers through June, or is it budgeted numbers?
That's budgeted numbers.
So when we're looking
Original
at this,
budget.
we're not looking, if you will, apples to apples in the budget versus the actual trend line. So we're really looking at, these have not been updated relative to actual numbers. These are original forecasted 2016-17 numbers.
Yes, ma'am. Those were also budgeted in accordance with the rate plan at that time.
So if we talk about actuals right now, the sales number increase versus actual through third quarter of this year, what would that number be?
at June 30th, we were tracking at 68% of our water sales, which it should be at 75%, but we see our high usage in the summer, and so we will see, we're tracking very close to what we had budgeted for last year.
Okay.
Ultimately, is what I'm trying to say.
So when we're looking at the $1.5 million, that's a pretty close estimate in terms of what actual 2016-17 will be
Yes, ma'am.
versus the increase projected for 17 and 18.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And the other is,
We see revenue in other ways than water sales. We have the city farm leases. We have lake leases around Nasworthy, rentals, the camping fees out at the lake. All of those are pretty steady. A large portion of this is due to the lake leases and the increase in those.
all right, we bought the Ford Ranch, and there were leases on the Ford Ranch. Are those in here?
Yes, those would be in the other category, but the lease from the ranch will be used to pay debt service, so it won't be an overall increase in the budget. It'll just be used to fund that additional debt service.
And, okay,
Partially funded, yes, sorry.
meaning 50%, 60%, 10%?
All of that revenue will be used for debt service, but it will not be enough to cover the entire cost of the debt service.
Yes, and so what percent of the debt service will it cover?
I don't have.
Are you budgeting roughly
It's almost
$300,000?
$300,000, and the debt service is $3 million, so 10%.
There should also be. We anticipate some operating costs associated with that 300. That 300 is the lease income, or it's the net lease income?
It is the lease income, not the net
So
income.
there are
gross.
some ranch expenditures we expect to have to pay from that money also, right?
That is correct.
Is that in your operating and maintenance and under expenditures? Because there's a $3 million increase in that over last year, so describe that.
The $3 million O&M is mainly attributed to the debt service for the Ford Ranch.
So that's where it's reflected, the debt service?
Yes.
So that's the 3 million. So basically, you have a $242,000 increase outside the actual debt service.
It's a little over 3 million for the debt service. I don't have that exact number.
All right, and you have a $225,000 increase in capital expense. What's that?
This would be in line to keep up with the street program, so the water main replacement, and we're also doing the water master plan, which has the infrastructure needs for the water replacement. So this additional capital expense will be spent on water line replacement.
And that is in conjunction with the street work.
We are working towards that, yes. But right now, yes, it is the part that is going to be done before the street.
And what are those additional costs that we will incur with the Ford Ranch purchase in terms of things that you said we would have to spend money on?
We don't know what those really are right at this time, but we're going to
We know
do.
what 50,000 is.
And that would be what?
The pilot?
Is that, are we paying that directly, or are the lessors paying that?
The lessors are paying that.
Okay.
There's some road maintenance and things like that we have several miles of roads on the ranch that we have to maintain, so that'll be some expenses that we'll have directly ongoing each year to maintain. There's some other things, the fencing and stuff, just the things that we'll have to do over the next few years, well, actually the whole time we're out there. So we anticipate using those funds to.
And the fencing is because you have ag leases out there, so we're responsible for the fencing?
Well, there's
Or
some
we're
things that
doing-
we need to fix, just as part of our operation out there.
Let me zoom out maybe to a 50,000-foot level. You know, at some point, we're going to have to start talking about water treatment, wastewater treatment, and that sort of thing in terms of upgrades. Is that something that will be a separate discussion item from you all at some point in the future? Is that a different day, different discussion? But at some point, when will we start having the discussions, you know, here's what we may need to do out there, here's what, you know, the expected cost would be? Is now not the time to have that conversation?
Well, we can have it to the extent that we have the answers for that. The project that I've been discussing with you here recently will include developing that information
Okay,
so that we understand
okay.
exactly what we need to do and what it's going to cost.
Okay, yeah.
And that's inclusive of the 5 wells perhaps and the water treatment plant, or is that just the water treatment plant?
Well, there's 2 treatment plants. The one associated with the wells, I mean, that's a different project than what I think Mr. Heber's talking about. He's talking about our surface water treatment facility that's very old and needs upgrading, and then our wastewater treatment facility. They're the ones that we understand on the groundwater side, we know what we need to do there. On the surface water side and the wastewater treatment plant, there's some other information that we need to develop to understand what those upgrades need to be, and one of those is what our future water supply sources would be.
So that's based off of future water supplies, not existing water supplies?
Well, we know what our existing supplies are and what it takes to treat those, but we want to make sure that we are not too, that we are as farsighted as possible in understanding what we're going to need to do in the future so that we can accommodate that.
For example, Bill, there are some sources west of here that are very brackish, and that would need some special water treatment in order to get it to consumer use. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes, sir. And it's not even, I mean, that's, of course, a brackish supply, but even depending on what our, whatever the supply is, could impact what treatment processes are used. And so we just need to understand that. And again, that's part of the project that we've been talking about, is that to develop that information so that we can move forward. We have a plan, and it has, including a timeline and costs.
Has there been any discussion about moving the water treatment plant outside the city limits?
We have not, no, ma'am.
If I can go down a short rabbit trail for just a minute. A while ago, we were talking about the solid waste fund, and Shane is saving up for a known large expenditure in the future. He has an idea of the time frame and has an idea of the amount. So we have a plan where we're hoping to pay cash for something we think is going to be $10 million or less. This is an example of a fund that is somewhat in recovery. We're trying to build that fund balance back where we think it needs to be. Thinking early about setting money aside for future capital expenditures is how you get that, how you avoid debt, larger amounts of debt in the future. It's probably not realistic to think that we would, in a short period of time, save $100 million toward these big improvements we're talking about. But to the extent you can continue to build the fund balance with the idea that you would cash flow some of those, even a small piece of those large expenditures, if that's consistent. I know some of you have talked to us about minimizing our debt load. And now is the time to think about that if you have an idea that you want to spend big money in the future.
If I can just piggyback on that a minute, an example of that, of course, is what Allison was talking about with our infrastructure rehab in relation to the street program. Obviously, we have those needs. We're not just replacing them because we're redoing the streets. That infrastructure needs to be replaced as well. But we're hoping to be able to cash fund that as much as possible. But over the next, the street program is $80 million over the next 10 years. An example is what you're going to see with Bell Street is the water and sewer replacement is considerably the largest part of that expenditure for that project. We're very likely going to see that as we move through the street program. The point being is it's going to be expensive. And so in order to cash fund that and not have to incur debt for that, we're going to have to plan for that up front to be able to have those funds available to keep up with that program.
Well, which is a good point, but I also see the budget only has $225,000 budgeted towards that. So when you talk about it's a great expense, what does $225,000 buy you relative to, quote, the expense that you're indicating?
I think she's referring to the increase.
The increase.
That's just the increase, right?
Correct.
That's correct.
So you're basically planning to spend $2.655777 towards infrastructure repairs attached to street.
There's also a dedicated fund, the Water Capital Fund, that goes along with the CIP plan, and so that has money in it as well that is dedicated to water line replacement as well.
So what is the total dollar water replacement infrastructure improvements we're speaking about in this 2018 budget?
Mayor, while they're digging for those numbers, these capital amounts would also be where they would replace equipment. Trucks that crews go out in.
That's correct.
Backhoes, whatever they need, that would come out of this capital line also.
So can you talk about the difference between capital improvement relative to trucks and backhoes, et cetera, versus actual infrastructure improvements?
Yes. Give me one second.
Sure.
They're currently in the Water Capital Fund, which is the one outside of this one. There is $2.8 million set aside for infrastructure improvement to water line replacement. And of this capital expense on this slide, right at $2 million is, pretty close to $2 million is dedicated to water line improvement. So $4.8 million. Roughly.
All right, so $655,000 is going towards new equipment, replacement equipment?
Roughly, yes.
Vehicles, machinery, and that's also technology improvements, computers.
Describe the technology improvements.
With all of our divisions, there's 6 divisions under both Bill and I, computer, servers, those type of technology improvements. That is minimal compared to the machinery and vehicles, though. This is one of the first years that Water Utilities has bought vehicles and machinery in, I believe, about 3 years, so.
And the Benedetti machine is where? Was in what fund?
This, yes, it came out of the street bond fund. So, Allison, did y'all purchase some dump trucks this year? Just to give an idea of how much one of those pieces of equipment costs just by itself.
We did purchase 2 dump trucks this year, and I don't
I think they
remember.
were 200, 250 each, so their equipment adds up rather quickly. The 600,000 doesn't really go that far. Okay, sorry, 110, so it was 220,000 together, but.
A VACCON is 315,000, and they have 2 of them.
So, Bill, Allison, as we move forward with whatever you will be bringing to us soon, next 30, 45 days, you know, we're going to be talking about some really big numbers. I assume when we're talking about future water supplies, when we're talking about treating those water supplies, when we're talking about upgrades to facilities, when we're talking about upgrades to wastewater treatment facilities, and so we're talking big numbers. So you will have the revenues and expenditures tied to those sorts of things. This is really day-to-day operations, you know, in our water fund. But when we're talking about what we've got to look for the citizens 5, 10, 15, and 20 years down the road, we're not touching it here.
That's correct. There's nothing in here that, for funding any of the infrastructure, you know, the treatment plants, upgrades, or future water supply. There's nothing in here that's related to that at this point.
Okay.
What's our water fund balance right now?
At the end of this fiscal year is anticipated to be a little over 3 million, about 3.1 million, which gives us about 50 days, I think, in cash on hand, and our goal, of course, is 75, and that's a minimum, I would think.
Be not necessarily the gold standard. That's probably not achievable. But what would give you in your line of work comfort in terms of coverage?
I think generally what you would see in the utility business is probably 90 to 100 days. Again, I think 75 days is minimum.
Okay, so we're looking at trying to achieve double the number roughly that.
The current goal we've said is that the council adopted was 75 days,
Okay.
so we're hoping to
You're
get
shooting
there
for
within-
that, but if we can go above and beyond, that would be nice too.
But Bill, the 5-year water plan basically was to get to 75 days and then have some dollars for some of these other particular needs. Is that correct?
That's correct. We meet the other needs and still build up our fund balance to a 75 days cash on hand.
This fund has the disadvantage of being highly seasonal in that in the beginning of the fiscal year, water sales are low because we're in the fall and winter, and we hope to climb out of that deficit. We touched on revenue earlier. We're 3/4 of the way through the year and only 68% revenue. We think that we will climb out of that this year, but that means that the fund in those lean months relies on its fund balance. And it routinely gets lower than it should be during those months. And so achieving some base level to facilitate operations we think is appropriate.
And even on looking at the overall 5-year plan, since you know the revenue is highly impacted by weather, we could have, you have to look at it on a 5-year basis because in projecting the revenues, we normalize the usage so that we have a straight line, if you will, on usage, knowing that that's not the case. And so looking out over the 5 years, we would anticipate having the fund balance to be where it needs to be. But we could have negative years and then high years depending on weather. So you really want to look at it over a multi-year period, and that's what the plan has done.
Okay.
And on top of that, our expenditures don't always track just linear either, because we have some years we have larger expenditures than others. So all that has to be taken into consideration in that.
But that's
outlook.
what budgeting's about.
So,
Purposes, are we talking about, besides the utility equipment such as backhoes, dump trucks, the vehicles that the guys go out on, just the trucks, are we replacing just basic work trucks, or?
we do, yes.
Okay, how many are we looking at? What are the costs of those? What are the lifetime usage of what we have currently? Are they wearing out? What are we budgeting for?
For vehicles, we have a little over $300,000 budgeted for vehicles, and that would include everything from the pickup to the service beds. But as far as pricing on individual trucks, I don't have those numbers. I'd need Ryan Kramer to probably speak to that. But we work closely with him. He gives us a list of trucks or vehicles that have reached their lifespan in terms of mileage and how often he's seeing them in his shop, and how much we're putting back into the truck, and is it worth it to replace and put in the auction.
Okay.
So
Do we
work
have
very
our-
closely
oh,
with
sorry.
him to coordinate that.
Okay.
Do we have our own inventory of parts, and or do we have a contract with somebody for buying parts and maintaining the equipment?
Are you talking about vehicles or with like water infrastructure?
Our
Vehicles.
fleet services division is where we do our vehicle maintenance, and we do have a contract with Napa for parts and inventory.
And where will we be, is that, that will be in another area that we're going to talk about today?
Fleet services, I don't think that we have that on discussion for today, but Shane is here, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer questions
Well,
that
if
he
it's
could.
next, on the next budget meeting, I'm fine talking about it then. I just want to make sure we talk
It's
about it.
it's not one of our major funds, so if we do want to discuss it, it would be fine to do that today.
Okay, let's talk about it.
Okay. Shane, do you want Shane to come up now, or do you want to finish with water first?
We can finish with this. If there's any other further questions on this area. So I think we're good. So.
Okay. Just let him answer questions and tell him if they need more information. And if you'd like us to work up one of these slides like this for discussion at the next meeting, we can do that as well if we're not able to answer the questions that you have today.
Great. So describe to me what this contract is and how it works.
The Napa contract?
Yes, sir.
We used to do all of our parts inventory ourselves back several years ago. And we found ourselves that we'd have parts inventory, and some of it would actually become obsolete before we would use it, or we would turn it due to changes in fleet, due to changes in years of fleet. And so we actually work through, and what a lot of other cities and municipalities around the country do, they have gone to basically using a provider such as Napa to actually do their parts acquisition. So they're a national company. They have huge buying power, as to where we by ourselves do not. And of course, it also cuts down a lot of the issues that we also have, from the purchasing issues about spending a lot of staff time taking bids and doing this and going through all the parts and stuff. So we actually, I guess it was probably 4 years ago now. Going on third year, we've have a contract with Napa. And basically what we do is they come in, we provide them a space within our shop, and they basically set up a little mini parts store for us, and our guys, our computer system and their computer system are tied directly together. As our guys need parts, they put it into the computer, it automatically goes to them. They either go pull parts off the shelf and have it ready for our guys, or they order from their national distribution center and it's here the next day. And so that's, and it's become a lot more efficient for us. We're getting our parts a lot faster. Our downtimes on our machines are actually a lot quicker, because their availability for parts is so much quicker than what our, if we had to order something through one of our local parts suppliers or through the local Ford House or Dodge House or whatever, that might take 2 or 3 days. To now, the efficiency has just picked up substantially, and the costs are actually even though we're paying a little premium on their parts, they get to buy their parts so much cheaper than we were able to buy them before that we're really kind of the costs offset themselves.
So give me a typical cost structure. So if the part costs $50, they get what percent of that for?
10% markup on that is what they get.
So they
on
make
that.
their markup ordering it and then 10% on top of that, which is what we pay.
Yes.
And so do we also pay the salary of that person from?
From the ones that work for Napa, no, they pay their. There's a management fee that goes with it.
Is that a
includes
percentage? Or is it a salary?
It's a straight number, a straight cost number.
So it doesn't go up or down relative to how many parts that we order or?
No,
anything. It's-
that management fee is set based on
And what is that number?
that person. I would about 40,000
A year?
annually. Yes.
Yeah.
And there's two parts. They run two different.
Two full-time employees and one part-time employee.
Okay.
Shane, how did that contract affect your staffing?
We
Didn't
were.
you reduce?
Yeah, we did. We reduced our staff to accommodate, and actually, they went to work for our people that were in the parts room. One of them retired, and the other one did go to work for Napa. So,
Shane, you also don't have, as far as inventory expense tied up to
yes,
inventory.
we don't
that's
have any of
gone.
our money tied up in inventory anymore. We used to have. I can't remember. Patrick, you remember what your inventories were back then? I can't remember that far back but we had quite substantial amounts of dollars tied up in inventory.
Back when we ran our own parts room, we carried an on-the-books inventory of about $140,000 in parts. We had an annual shrinkage, though, of approximately anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000 in parts. That's due to loss. That's due to obsolescence as well. Not to mention that we had to run our own inventories, not only from a semi-annual basis, but then our annual inventory as well. So that was an overtime expense for the shop as well. So we were able to eliminate all of that expense by moving to Napa. The other thing that Napa really garnered us was a way to search for parts. In the past, we didn't have a good system to look for it. All we had was our historical buying. So Napa was able to use their resources and their software in order to find the appropriate parts the first time for us. So we got a lot of benefit of moving that. Not only did we eliminate the parts inventory on our books and free up that capital and that money, but we were able to get parts, the right parts, a lot quicker and at a lot better price. So.
And wouldn't you also, when you look at two employees, if I understood Shane correctly, that we, in effect, eliminated two positions that we were paying for the salaries plus the benefits, wouldn't it be a cost savings there if we're paying a $40,000 annually management fee versus two employee salaries plus their benefits cost and all of the costs associated? So we saw savings there as well?
That was basically a wash for us, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
When did we go into this system? 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
We're in our third year of it. This is our first full term. We're coming up to the end of the first full term, and we have 2 one-year extensions. So we have the option to extend for 2 more years with them. And at this point, the benefit that we're seeing absolutely subsidizes or supports that extension.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else on the purchasing or the?
No, I just wanted to understand how the process worked and relative to why we made the decision to go from basically in-house inventory management and parts ordering versus contract.
Okay.
Before y'all get away, one of the things we do struggle with regularly is replacement of equipment in funds. That lighter duty equipment, 1/2 to 3/4 ton trucks, is that, and
1 ton, yeah, half to 1 ton, yeah.
we struggle with that regularly, and what they advise is that when we slow down the replacement of vehicles, this makes sense, you can predict, and we do see an increase in repair and maintenance expense and downtime that goes with that. So they are constantly fighting that battle to keep the downtime at a minimum, keep the repair expense low, and manage how to replace equipment within a tight budget. Is that a fair statement?
I would add very tight to that, but yes.
Like our households, right? The same thing we do at home.
The play.
When we do take a piece of equipment offline and we do auction it, those Ryan, when he puts them in the and of course we've gone to an online auction system instead of a on-site auction, and we've seen incredible gains just by doing that because it opens it up to a much bigger buyer base, and so we have seen good there. But as Ryan does that, whatever fund that vehicle or piece of equipment came out of, Ryan tracks that and keeps those funds separate, and then those funds, whatever proceeds that we receive from the auction, go back into that fund that machine came out of.
So do we go ahead and budget for it, and then once we see those numbers come in, it just helps that decrease what our actual cost is?
Yes.
So give me a number that we would get from the auction in total.
The last one we ran was 70 or 80,000, and it was a small auction with mostly just vehicles. And we'll see anywhere from some of our very heavily used vehicles will sell for 2,500 to 3,000, up to when we sell some specialized piece of equipment, street sweeper or one of those type things. They can go for as high as 50 and 60,000. So now, granted, based off purchase price, they're kind of equivalent to some degree, but it's
Who would buy a street sweeper from us? Another municipality?
other smaller municipalities would buy it
So-
from us. We have we do have a lot of people from other countries actually buying some of our equipment now, especially the specialized equipment. When we start talking about back-ons and street sweepers and some of those type things. And you have, again, smaller communities will buy it, and then you also have just sometimes private contractors small contractors that are just trying to get a business started will end up buying some of our dump trucks, those type things, and some of our, again, specialty equipment.
So what percentage do we usually see from the auction on our total vehicle replacement? How much does that bring in, that 75,000?
From what we spend
What we
annually,
annually, yeah, what we're
annually,
budgeting
we're
for.
budgeted 1.21 million, I believe, for equipment replacement.
In the general fund only.
In the general fund only, 1.21 million in the general fund.
It's a small percentage.
Yeah, we might see,
10%.
he said 10%. I'd say that's probably a little high even on return on that, so.
But that doesn't go in your, because we don't see the fleet services screen, so we don't know how that breaks down.
So that auction proceeds is budgeted in Fund 501, which is our general equipment replacement fund. And this year they had budgeted $55,000 in revenue and made $76,597.
And
So that-
that's in the general fund.
That's
so-
for the general fund only, yes.
Yes.
So those proceeds go to fund the next round of purchases.
Thank you.
Is our civic events fund. Again, I pointed out earlier that you will see some significant changes here, but that is largely due to the way we're accounting for it and breaking out the hotel occupancy tax into a different fund so that we feel like that's more transparent. And then the revenue stream would be from the hotel occupancy tax fund into the civic events fund for their 48% that they receive from that revenue stream.
So where will we see on these budgeted areas, where will we see that other revenue?
That'll be up shortly. We'll discuss the hot fund, Fund 605, in a few minutes.
Okay. So when we look at this and we see a $965,000 decrease, it's not apples to apples. So when you talk about this, give me apples to apples.
So we are budgeting hotel occupancy tax revenue the same as we did last year at $1,857,000, $1,857,500. So the revenue stream that you see coming into the Civic Events Fund for that would be 48% of that amount. So it did not change from last year for their revenue from hotel occupancy tax.
So we're basically, for Civic Events Fund, planning it flat to last year.
Flat. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So this, where it says $1 million decrease, it's not really $1 million decrease. You're really talking about flat.
That $1 million
revenue.
would be related to the portions that would have been allocated to
Yes.
CVB, DSA, all of those organizations. And you'll see those later on in the presentation.
Okay.
So the internal, the internal difference in Civic Events Fund is the $37,000 that you see up there. And that largely is due to a downward trend in rentals, particularly at the convention center. We had budgeted this year based on trends of the previous year, mostly when we were still getting a lot of rentals from the oil industry, oil companies doing different trainings at the convention center, and a little bit a downward trend in advertising sales. So that's what that difference is, the $37,000.
So relative to, weddings and banquets, et cetera, how is that trend?
It's still pretty flat. We've seen a little bit of downward trend just because of the downward trend in the general economy, but we hope that'll pick back up. But we just budgeted a little bit lower than last year based on the recent trends we've seen in rentals. And I would like to mention that the last few months we've seen an upward trend in, as you've noticed, concerts. So that has increased recently, our concession sales, and some some other rentals, Coliseum and the River Stage, that we hadn't experienced recently.
What percent do we get off of the concessions?
It's 25% for alcohol and 20% for food and soft drinks.
Yes, ma'am.
Process question. If I'm looking in the blue book
Yes, ma'am.
and looking at all of the revenue lines, would that add up to the 2.4? Because I see hotel motel revenue, Coliseum.
Yes, that should add up to the 2.4.
So that would add up to that number that's there for
Yes.
the original. Okay, thank you.
So what's the opportunity for increased rentals, whether it be Coliseum, McNeese Convention Center, River Stage, et cetera? What's the strategic plan to bring in more revenue in those facilities?
Well, particularly the River Stage, you started to see that new plan take shape the last few months. Working with different promoters, we've been bringing in new acts. It's not just been one promoter, it's been 3 different promoters. Also, that could spill over to the Coliseum. As far as the convention center, it's thank you. It's a little bit based on different usage. So
Center and Coliseum, one of the things has been discussed amongst the groups and some with Carl's Civic Events Board is the limitation of the buildings, the convention center, to be able to accommodate conferences and those things here in San Angelo, mainly because it's lacking some breakout room that you need to pull in those type of conventions, and it's lacking an exhibit hall. So those groups have talked about that. They've talked about potentially looking at developing a plan for that, and in looking at the whole process of how you fund that. The hot money, of course, is not at this point going to support that. So there have been things discussed such as a venue tax. Those are things that are placed on a hotel room. Some communities do to help fund those type of projects, which then can assist in bringing in conventions and everything, other things to actually enlarge your usage of the facilities. Did I leave anything out, Carl?
right, and we've also been working a lot closer with CVB, Diane, who's new with the CVB, to try to market our facilities better.
I think as they came in, one thing I noticed that they have started to try and do is also look at smaller conventions that can actually be accommodated here. The thing we struggle with is, for instance, we hosted Texas Parks and Recreation here several years ago. We were able to pull that in, assist from a city standpoint with our connections. We bid on that again, and they turned us down not because we don't have enough hotel rooms. It's because the building can't accommodate it.
Right.
So even those that we think we could get for San Angelo we can't get them because the building won't hold it.
Well, we can't change what the buildings are, but we also know that regardless of the negatives, there's got to be some positives because we own those buildings. We got expense to maintain those buildings. So at some point, we got to strategize how to maximize those buildings and those assets because we own them. And the expense of maintaining them does not go away regardless of the negatives attached to those facilities. So we have to look at what the positives of those facilities are and try to market towards those because we own them.
We agree. I think the staff does a good job of booking and running those facilities. Typically, the city contracts with the CVB, who is responsible for helping to market and push forward bringing outside events. Our staff does a very good job primarily of focusing on the local use of those buildings. And as you said earlier, we have a lot of weddings, we have quinceaneras, all those kind of things that happen there. The thing that has dropped is the meeting times going on that was largely driven a lot by the oil industry over the past few years. That has dropped off drastically. We have a fee structure that we went over a few years ago to try and encourage more use. It allows for a cheaper rate during those off times. So a lot of that's in place. And of course, I think your board always looks at that to see if there's other opportunity.
That's correct.
Speaking of that, I see that there's no capital expense budgeted for 17-18. Does that mean there are no capital issues and that the buildings are in top shape and there's no expense associated with maintaining those buildings?
Clearly not. As you know, we did go to the city council about a year ago and got almost $500,000 to do different improvements throughout the civic events facilities. And most of those projects are wrapping up. And there's only a few more left. We'll be coming back to council likely in September to give an update on the progress of all those projects. And we intend to ask council for some additional funds to do some other improvements.
And that's a good question. Because for good or bad, the way that it is typically operated in the past, a lot of departments will build into the budget a certain amount of capital improvement budgeted within his yearly budget. The way they have typically operated is that they have their operating budget in general, and then if they have above and beyond, such as large improvement projects, they have to come to you and the Civic Events Board and say, okay, we want to do this, and there's X amount of money in the hot fund, so we want you to allocate additional dollars for those improvements. Another way to do it would be you could, allocate a certain amount per year just in his budget to start with. That would make it easier on them, but not as much accountability as having to come and justify the project to this board.
So after we made this investment in all facilities, what's our fund balance going to be towards the end of this fiscal year?
I don't have that information with me right now because we did break it out into the two separate funds and we haven't published that into our blue book yet. But our goal is to leave the Civic Events Fund with a 90-day operating fund balance. And then the rest would go into the Fund 605 Hotel Occupancy Tax Fund balance.
And I think you're asking what the hot fund balance is, right?
Correct.
Right, but I don't have it broken out in that way.
Well, my challenge would be the following is that, again, in a conversation, maximizing facilities because we own them, they cost us, it exists, the expense doesn't go away. So at some point, we have to take a look at facility by facility and say, what's our priority in terms of potential revenue increases in that facility, and what would it take, what does it take from a capital expense to ensure we maximize revenue for that facility so that we don't have conversations about, well, the reason we can't do it is. What we don't want to hear is we can't lease it out because of the following negatives. I want to know what we need to be able to lease something out to increase revenue, and focusing requests and strategic plans or capital expenditures towards maximizing a resource. For example, the river stage as a facility. For as long as I've lived in San Angelo, everyone talks about what that river stage should be and could be if it was brought up to a level of X. What's that level of X to maximize the river stage? Because we We've spent $14 million improving the river.
True.
What are we doing to improve the river stage to maximize the use of the river stage on the $14 million river? Because that's one of the biggest assets we have, quote, is the river.
We do have ideas, and we'll be coming back to council with those ideas.
Yeah, and in the meantime, what I can say, and Carl touched on it a while ago, is they have focused on the river stage events, and as you've seen, there have been a lot more events going on there. So what we tried to focus on is, while we haven't had funding allocated to do large improvements there, basically what you just said a while ago, we focused on, okay, we don't have those improvements yet, but how can we improve the number of events? And they've been very successful in that.
Correct.
But yeah, I think what we need really the most, there's a group talking about the Coliseum, there's a group talking about the Convention Center, there's a desire for the river stage. We really need those prioritized. What we would like to do is eventually bring something back to y'all and say, okay, there's all these projects. We clearly can't do them all at once. What is our top priority? Which one do we focus on? And now we like to focus on all of them and look for opportunities, and maybe one rises to the top because of an opportunity for grant funding or whatever. But that will help us, like at a work session when y'all are having one where we might discuss this topic in general and kind of get a focus on what is the top priority, and then we can hone in on that.
Well, as a top priority, I strongly believe that we have to make sure we maximize existing assets, because the bigger the pot in terms of more facilities, the more expensive it is to maintain all of them, and then we have to choose between A and B or C and D or J and K. And so all of the facilities lack the level of maintenance that perhaps we would like to give that facility, and it doesn't help if we add more facilities to the pot. What I like to make sure we do is to make sure the facilities that we own function correctly, and that we don't make excuses for why the facilities don't work.
I think we can handle that, and I think they can bring those back to you, and Carl may have more to add on that. The point I was going on the helping to look into the future is to help us. What I want to do is, we know that the oil is going to come and go. And so in those, when it's gone, how are we going to make sure that we still have those hot dollars coming in? So whether that's improvements to the river stage or convention center or Coliseum, whatever that is, that's where I'm looking for the community buy-in as to what is the top priority to focus on. And in the meantime, I think Carl can address what you're speaking to as well.
I do believe we need to look forward to make sure we move our community forward in terms of potential opportunities. I just don't want to ignore existing problems.
Yes.
And I don't like those problems to grow in terms of expense and lack of attention to, or lack of an audience to use that facility because we haven't maintained them. And I know there's always a struggle with maintenance dollars for existing facilities, but they don't improve over time, they get worse over time. So I want to make sure we don't ignore it. Wherever those dollars are, I want to make sure strategically we have a plan for maintaining our buildings to get maximum value out of our assets.
Very good.
And in terms of the improvements, we have envisioned improvements that will maximize those assets, and it is reflected in the capital improvement plan for each of those facilities.
The great part is what I'm hearing is don't be shy about bringing that plan to the council. We know it'll take some hot funds and maybe we can leverage other dollars, but don't ignore that maintenance and bring it to y'all. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Carl, if you could just stay seated, we're going to talk about the Fort Concho Fund next.
What?
Fort Concho Fund is up next.
What about it?
Just if they have any questions about it.
Oh, sure.
I know that we are planning on some major improvements to the fort. Talk about if there's anything in here relative to that, or that's not going to happen until the 18 and 19 budget. I know you have a $2 million investment that's out there. I don't see that number up here, so my assumption is that $2 million isn't going to be put to work in the 17-18 budget.
Well, the city's not holding that money for that particular project, the $2 million project.
So when we approve that and the money's coming out of the Area Foundation,
That's correct.
then we will look at that as a part of this once that revenue once that dollar amount will come into here. It will be in the capital?
In terms of capital, no, it's not. Those funds for the development of those buildings will not touch city accounts. It will affect us once they're built.
Yeah, we'll fund that, sort of like in a way, in a manner that we did with the auditorium, where we have a partnership. So some of those dollars actually may never come into the city coffers. We will contract, we have a contractual agreement between the two entities, and they may actually pay the bills. We actually oversee the project and approve that, yes, the work has been done, and now it is ready for payment, and then that entity processes it most likely.
So once it is done, then the operating and maintenance
Right.
of that improvement will come into this budget.
Yes.
Right.
Meanwhile, I know there's a lot of things at the fort that need work done on, and I only see a $3,000 capital improvement in this fund. And so my question is, once again, what does $3,000 buy us? I know it doesn't buy us the improvements just in paint and scraping and painting.
Right.
Is that correct, Carl?
That's correct. And we did increase maintenance
By
more than
$25,000.
usual, more than 3,000. It's right overall. I think about $30,000 just in terms of buildings and grounds maintenance we increased for this year. So that reflects the overall need that you're talking about. We do have two other major projects: the renovation of Officers' Quarters 1 and the Visitor Center in Barracks 1 and 2. But you're also talking just across the board, the need to upgrade facilities.
So the $321,582 does what?
That's all the related expenses, utilities, repairs, maintenance, all operations except
What
for
are
personnel.
utilities? Take the utilities number out of there. What is the,
Buildings and grounds number?
uh-huh?
One of the things that we have had a plan for some time now in place is that when we brought on the state office complex buildings, the plan was to focus on moving the fort off of the city as far as its subsidy and reducing that amount. So actually, we're like in that time frame now in the next year. So you're going to see income coming in from the state office complex for the fort. One of our goals is, while we want to reduce that subsidy that the city's putting in, I think you've keyed on another thing. We've got some areas we've neglected over the years as far as maintenance, because that's the first thing to go. So I would recommend over the next few years, as we transition that, down from the city, we may hold for a little bit, get all of our house in order as far as our maintenance goes, and in the same breath start reducing that general fund subsidy where we're relying more on the income from the state office complex.
So basically, our debt service on the state building
Exactly.
goes away. So then what we have is the revenue side only associated
Yes.
with that building. But then I'm assuming we also, at that point in time, also take on some new maintenance issues
Exactly.
that exist with that building as
Yeah.
well. So the question mark is how much of the rent takes care of the maintenance versus what is
Right.
available once the maintenance of that building is done,
Yes.
goes into what?
And have you stated before, we can't deny the maintenance. So one of the buildings that we haven't neglected maintenance, I don't think, on really at all, is the state office complex, because we've got it leased out. We have to make our client happy, so we've done those things and maintained it. So that fund will now, still maintain that state office complex at the level we need, but I think be able to increase our maintenance at the fort. Where you see it, we constantly have rotting boards, and I mean, it's just a maintenance, a
It
jewel,
is.
but it's a maintenance.
It's a jewel, we got to take care of it.
When we bring on new facilities like you're talking about doing at the fort, is there a specific plan, to go to the mayor's point specifically, of making sure that these new facilities don't get behind on their routine maintenance just simply because we don't have the funds? Is there a plan specifically to make sure that we stay up with those things we need to stay up with?
Now, this building is not a new building. You're talking about the new visitor center project?
$2 million project.
$2 million
Barracks 3 and
project.
4, which is private funding through the Area Foundation.
But we're going to get the facilities, so we're going to have to maintain those. So what's the plan? You don't have to lay it out here, but I'm really asking, is there a specific plan to address those maintenance issues over the next 25 years so that we don't have this conversation that the mayor's talking about, and we don't dump this on a future council to have to deal with?
We do have a general plan, and we have a possibility to fund it.
What are the where are the fees? Like if you come visit the fort, it costs you what to come in and do a tour of the fort?
Well, that's part of other. The fort has
So
has
is the
several different revenue streams.
420,000 total admittance fees, or is that when another organization rents out the commissary for an event?
Right, for different events. We've seen a big trend upwards in terms of revenue for renting different facilities that we have. Officers' Quarters 8, Officers' Quarters 1, the stables, Living History stables, Barracks 6. We've seen an increase in rentals, and that's mostly where a good portion of our revenue comes from. In terms of fees, I mean, we get, there's membership fees, there's just a whole slew of different revenue streams that come in.
Let me go back and beat this horse one more time on from my standpoint. Let's be sure when we get this new facility, and anytime we get new facilities, that we capitalize those costs up front so that we can take care of the maintenance, again, so that we go to the mayor's point, that we don't have to have the conversation either on this council or on another council 10 years down the road, that they are then struggling to figure out how they're going to maintain those things. Let's have a plan in place before those facilities ever become ours, that, you know, we've got an opportunity, in my opinion, with this new facility. Let's figure out how we're going to maintain that for the long term go forward.
Carl, I think that the Fort Board really has looked at some of these things. So maybe sometime when we get through the budget, we can have Bob come and address the council on these things. And he could talk about the visitor center. He can also talk about the partnership that we've got with the Clements Foundation on repairing OQ1,
Right.
And those future projects that are out there. The fort really probably does a better job of public-private partnerships than anybody else in the city. And that started when I was on the board several years ago. So I think we need to continue to look at that. But Bob has all that information. I mean, the Fort Board has discussed it. I suspect that he more than likely has all of that information pulled together. So at some future time, September, October, whatever the time frame may be, maybe we can have him come make a presentation.
I mean, it's a jewel. I mean, there aren't that many forts in the United States of America. It's a jewel. And once again, I go back to strategically, what are we doing to maximize what that fort is? And when I say that, maximizing it relative to the revenue stream to help offset any capital maintenance issues that need to be done. Because right now, we're kind of just getting this, paying that out. You know, it's like, where is the opportunity here? What are we doing to make sure that rent line increases, that the other line increases? What are we doing to increase revenue strategically?
And I think Carl and them, just to give you all a little history perspective, what they've done on that is you'll see buildings that did not have a floor in them before, they put in a new wood floor. So those buildings are being rented out now. The big success most recently is the stables. It didn't have air conditioning. It had heating, but we could not rent it in the summers, period. Now it's booked almost all the time because we just opened that opportunity. So I think the board's done a good job at that, but we need to keep watching for those opportunities where we can bring in the revenue. So a little bit to answer Tommy's question, and we'll try and do it with the other buildings, but the auditorium is a good example. What we did was set up a fee structure where each ticket, a percentage, or actually I don't remember what it was, 50 cents or something off of each ticket goes into a city fund, and then that fund is used for the large maintenance option or things in the future. So it's set up as a committee that reviews those. If it's an expenditure over a certain amount, that comes before council for authorization. So we tried to set up that fee structure, and you have the ability to adjust that fee per ticket as needed. So it's geared at, okay, we don't want it to fall apart. It looks really nice now. If the general fund can't support it, how are we going to support it? So we've set up those in place, and we can, of course, those buildings don't necessarily have a ticketing thing with them, so we have to look at other ways to do that, but we'll do that.
And the concessions, alcohol, et cetera, where is that in the other column?
Not
So
here.
if somebody leases out the stables and,
It's part of the rent.
so the rent is the rent. Where does the concession revenue come into play? Does that go to the city totally, or is the concessions revenue in here as well?
For the fort, they don't really get concessions because their events are private events. Sometimes they have alcohol sales, and
Yes,
that comes back to the fort. But most of their events aren't using the city concessionaire.
So Carlo does not have exclusive rights at
the fort.
At
So
Food,
people
he
can
does for
bring in their
alcohol.
own.
Center, so
He
it
does
can
for
be
alcohol.
different.
So,
He does for alcohol, but not
For
food.
alcohol, but not for food.
yeah, so the alcohol sales, where are they?
It's part of the other.
Part of the other.
Right.
Okay, so
But it's not significant. It's not a big amount.
because people have events there that don't sell alcohol, so it's insignificant? Because anytime they serve alcohol right, you get revenue.
If it's sold, yes, if it's sold.
A lot of our events at the smaller buildings don't have alcohol in them. Go ahead.
It's such an insignificant amount that it's budgeted within another budget line, where we budget for admissions, booth rentals, sponsorships, those kinds of things. But beverage sales is included in that budget line in your budget. So I'm thinking we just group it in with all of that together.
And if it's an event like a wedding, for instance, at the stables, and the alcohol is not sold, it's the family providing it, then there's not a concession amount that comes to the
Correct.
city.
But if the city has, okay, so somebody can plan a wedding there, pay for the wedding and all the alcohol, and they don't have to use the city host
No,
group there? They do, regardless of
Go ahead,
whether the
Carl.
family pays for it or not, it's still alcohol.
They're supposed to because he does.
Supposed to. How do we
Supposed to.
regulate that?
I'm sorry. I can't hear it.
You said supposed to, so that doesn't sound very definitive when you say supposed to.
Right, because in the past, recent past, he hasn't been required to. We're trying to improve it such that he is the one that they have to go to if alcohol is provided. So it hasn't been across the board for all events.
So they don't have to use city host. I thought they did have to.
It should. They have to if they're selling it. If they're providing alcohol, they're supposed to. In the past, they haven't always.
So that's a clarification that your board and group has been working on.
Yes.
That has not been necessarily enforced as y'all thought it should be.
That's correct.
So that is something they have been changing in the recent future to make sure that's consistent.
Okay.
Because he has the licenses and the knowledge of the TABC laws.
Yes, but he's using our facilities
Correct.
to generate that
And
revenue.
then generally, we rely, if that's the case and Carlo is providing the alcohol, then they have to purchase it from him.
Correct.
And then he remits those concession percentages back to the city
That's
in his
correct.
payment.
Correct.
So that's the thing that he's clarifying,
Yeah.
if that makes sense, hopefully.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're working on that.
Right. We are.
Okay.
And I just wanted to follow up on your question about what the fee revenue is budgeted at. For next year, it's budgeted for $14,000. That's just the day-to-day tours that come in based on a fee schedule of $1.50 to $5 per person.
And right now, there's no facility charge on that, as you were talking about.
Not like
with the
Rick was
new
talking about,
auditorium.
no.
Yeah.
And that is solely day-to-day, people just coming in, doing self-guided
Right.
tours, things like that. That doesn't include, fees for things like the Christmas at Old Fort Concho, those kinds of things.
Right. There's a whole slew of other revenue streams.
Right.
And, we may look at, as you were talking about that in general, we used to have a River Stage fund that as we had events, it built up, and then you could use those dollars for improvements. Those may be things that the board will look at if council is receptive to that. Either at the River Stage, you have a, quarter per ticket that you add on, and that starts building that fund for these type of improvements that we want to make that can make it even a more used facility. But, anyway.
Okay. Thank you.
Next up, we have the Hotel Occupancy Tax Fund, Fund 605. This, again, is our new fund that we've created to account for the revenue stream from hotel occupancy tax. And the expenditures you'll see there are, again, those transfers out to our external partners and to our internal funds as well.
So just quickly go through the 1,857,500. So that's what we're going to bring in hot tax. And
That is what we are currently budgeting for next year, and that is flat from this fiscal year. We have not increased it or decreased it. Again, I did mention earlier that we will have to draw down our fund balance to fund the obligations that we already have in place as far as our external and internal partners. But that was something that we discussed with all of those stakeholders with City Manager's office, and we felt like that was the best route to take at this time. And then again, in March, we'll meet again with those folks and see where we need to move ahead for the next year.
But when you combine all of that, basically we are projecting flat the hotel occupancy tax to the 16-17 actuals.
Yes, ma'am. No, 16-17 budget.
And how is the budget relative to actual right now?
One moment. It's at 75.1% for revenue, and we're at 75% through the year.
So we're pretty good
On track.
And so relative to that, then you're planning it flat to 16-17, not only budget, but actual revenue.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And the other is what?
Other. I think it's interest income, interest revenue.
Okay. And the decrease is due to what?
That revenue under expenditure, again, that's where we plan to draw down the fund balance of the hotel occupancy tax to fund current obligations for next year.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You want to go through the external partners? That 1,045,000?
Sure. 48% goes to the Civic Events Fund. So any revenue that we receive, we will, of course, multiply that by 48% and transfer it out to Civic Events. $865,000 is budgeted for the Chamber of Commerce CVB. 5% goes to the San Angelo Cultural Affairs Council. $37,500 goes to downtown San Angelo. $50,000 for Fort Concho. $50,000 for Texas Bank Sports Complex.
How much for the bank complex?
$50,000, yes, ma'am. And $50,000 for the San Angelo Performing Arts Coalition.
Okay. And the CVB is a set number, not a percentage.
That's correct. $865,000 flat.
That changed 4 or 5 years ago?
Correct.
It did. It used to be 47% of hotel receipts.
Okay. Thank you.
Just one development corporation. Finally, for the funds that we had for discussion today, is the Development Corporation. I'll ask Mr. Pena to come up and talk with us about his budget, if he doesn't mind.
Council.
Good morning. Good morning. So when we look at the decrease of $1,150,000, that is relative to the budget, not relative to the current sales trend. So if you were budgeting based off a trend, you'd be at $8,450,000. Is that what that says? No. Yeah.
Oh.
So you say budgeting the same sales tax income as a general fund, they would have $8,450,000 in revenue, not the.
Right. That's in line with what we are currently planning to propose for sales tax revenue for the general fund, the $8,450,000. So.
And that is what percent decrease from 2016 and 17?
I don't know the percentage. It's a $300,000 decrease to our original budget for 16-17.
And so right now, for the past 2 months, hopefully a 3-month trend, we're actually increasing over last year. So right now, what we're doing is budgeting to actual numbers, not a 90-day sales tax trend.
It's a mixture. There's more to it than that. We do look at a trend over the last several years as well.
We're still waiting for one, I'm sorry, Mayor.
Go ahead.
We're still waiting for those numbers to come in as far as sales tax numbers, and
Yes,
perhaps
sir.
maybe by tomorrow. we'll
Tomorrow,
have
we
a
should
better
have those
indication.
sales tax numbers. And again, that's just our conservative initial estimate for sales tax. We haven't presented that to council yet, but that's what we're thinking right now that we could optimistically achieve. Again, after we receive sales tax numbers tomorrow, then we plan to sit down with Daniel again and discuss and make sure that we have a solid number to present to council when we discuss the general fund.
So on a big picture basis right now, the 2017-18 budget relative to 16 and 17 actual, what are we looking at?
We originally budgeted for sales tax for the general fund, $17.2 million.
And that was up or down from the prior year?
It was up 3%, I believe, from the prior year.
So relative to that, this trend, what's the 1,150,000 as a percentage decrease to actual, not plan?
Well, now, this is Development Corporation.
I
so
know,
it's-
but still, you have type B sales tax, so it's a sales tax trend line. And you're projecting 1,150,000 down from the budget,
Be that one divided
but
by
that's
100.
not an apples to apples. It's not about budget, it's about what the trend line is for 16 and 17 on type B sales tax.
Can I provide some insight? Mayor and council, just to provide some additional information, the Development Corporation begins their budget process around February of every year. And by May or June, we've solidified what we think is going to be the budget. And we do look at trends. As you know, this year has been very unusual. The trend line at some points during the course of the year has been below 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. To date, we're still down $573,000 from our estimated budget. Our board was wanting to be very conservative because we've had 2 years worth of non-attainable budget revenues just because of the sales tax situation.
And an actual versus budget, because budget was what was put out there.
Correct.
I
So-
want to know actual.
So we based our estimated budget based on actual of last year, and so we're going to be $1 million below last year's actual is what we've estimated. That's 11% for the Development Corporation. It's an 11% reduction in estimated revenues for us, which means we've also reduced our expenses by that same amount.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Roland, when you're doing the trend analysis like the mayor's talking about, you mentioned as far as having your numbers kind of solidified by June of the year. So does that mean as far as the trended numbers that you were looking prior to that? Because recently, of course, we've seen 2 months where those numbers have gone up, and hopefully this month will be the third month it'll be going up. So if you solidified your numbers in June, you were looking at a trend that was actually still flat or
That's
negative?
correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Just wanna make sure I'm
And so we're optimistically cautious. We've seen a couple of good months in the past 90 days, but we do have a month in between where we were down 3.34%. So we continue to monitor that. We think we have a good estimated number, probably a little bit more conservative than what finance and our budget manager predicted. But the board, because of what they've seen the last 2 years in terms of those actual revenues coming in, they wanted to be a little bit more conservative, just so that we don't get into a bind in the future.
No, and I think we should be. But on the other hand, I want to make sure it's relative to trend and actual, not budget, because budget means nothing to me at this point when you get into 2 months from the year ending. It's no longer a budget issue, it's a trend issue.
I wanted to mention that Roland's original budget for the current fiscal year was $8,850,000 total, I believe,
Last year, yes.
for the current year that we're
Yeah,
in.
correct.
Yes.
That's correct.
And we have had to lower that revenue budget by about $700,000. And so at June 30th, with that decrease to his original budget, he was at 74.7% for making revenue for the current year. So I think what he's seeing is $8.1 million maybe trend for the current year, if you take the original budget less what we've had to lower it. So
So from original budget,
8.1,
about
8.2.
$900,000 down.
Between 7 and 8
Yeah.
from original budget.
Also, we have the issue with budgeting strategy. We have the same revenue stream or very similar revenue stream, same revenue, different amounts, or different half cent versus general fund, which would be a full penny. But in the general fund, there is very high pressure to maximize the use of all revenues so that we can minimize the property tax and fee pressures associated with the citizens.
Agreed.
In this fund, if they are a little conservative and they budget for a lower amount so they know they can achieve it, it doesn't have that negative impact where it increases pressures on fees or on other tax revenues. It just decreases what's available to be spent in future projects, which is their line for economic development projects.
I agree.
So if they budget, let's say we budget 7.8 million, and they're actually coming in we actually think trend's going to be 8 million, and they need that extra 2 million, they can consider a budget amendment request to council to capture that extra 2 million. They've just been a little overly conservative, and so they're sure they can make budget, but they haven't increased the pressure like it would do in the general fund. In the general fund, if we under budgeted, we'd be capturing more that we could have put into potholes or into vehicle replacement or into some service that is a priority for council. In this case, they're shorting economic development, and usually the time frame associated with executing a project would allow for a budget amendment if we needed to capture additional revenue that already existed.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It's still an issue of trend, and that's all I'm asking about is trend. Regardless of general fund versus whatever, it's still here is this specific area, what's the trend line? Because it is something that we hope to have available to increase economic development, and to that extent, then you would say, so based off of those expenditures for economic development, what have those expenditures brought back to us in terms of economic development dollars? Sales tax increases? Are these companies bringing higher sales tax increasing? Are they bringing property tax increasing? Because obviously we're spending money to do something, and that would be ultimately to hopefully improve the property taxes in the general fund and the sales taxes, and perhaps other things to the general fund. So this has a dramatic impact based off of those dollars on these expenditures on the general fund relative to how wise those investments have been placed.
That's very well said, Mayor. As a matter of fact, we have a presentation after this is done that'll kind of really spell out what you're saying as well, because there's a huge impact of sales tax and property taxes offsetting each other to help each other out as well. So
Correct.
Tina will cover that in just a little bit, and she'll go more into detail about what you just said. You're right on the money, though.
Okay.
And that may be another day, another presentation, but do you have data that really goes straight to what the mayor was just then saying about increases in
We do. We do.
ad
And
valorem tax, in increase in jobs, and home sales? Do you capture that kind of data?
We do. Let me just give you an idea. This is detailed information, and so I'm glad I brought my laptop with me. So just to give you an idea, I'm going to focus on 3 areas. The business retention and expansion, for example. At the end of calendar year last year, we helped to generate 319 new jobs, which resulted in 449 new indirect jobs. We retained 303 jobs, and we had a capital investment of $5.3 million, with an annual economic output of 166 million. That's just in the BREP, Business Retention Expansion Program. You talk about
So when you talk about lost jobs, what did we do to prevent the lost jobs?
well, when we talk about retention of businesses and jobs, we secure an agreement, a performance agreement with the company. These are companies that are thinking of expanding or thinking of leaving the city of San Angelo. So if we've retained that company, we've retained that property tax on the ad valorem tax roll. And we've retained those jobs that are at risk of leaving the city. If this company is thinking of expanding in 5 years, and through our talks and negotiations, we can convince them to expand within this fiscal year or within the short term, then we've secured additional capital investment that goes on the tax rolls and increases those number of jobs, which in turn increases indirect jobs and provides an economic impact. We monitor that data, we gather that data, and we put together that kind of economic impact analysis for every one of our performance agreements.
Good. Keep going.
Okay. The council has been, and I do appreciate the entrepreneurial spirit that the council has displayed. I mean, you have been very supportive in the past. The City of San Angelo Development Corporation has a business incubator, and we reinstituted a business plan competition that helped us garner the past 2 years successful companies. From within the city, we've had innovation ideas that have turned into new companies, and they competed for these business plan competition dollars. And so we feel like we've generated some new companies as a result of that program. We do have companies that we incubate in the business incubator, and we do provide analysis about how many jobs are being created, and as they graduate and move into the city, what kind of capital investment they have, and we record that as additional economic impact information. In terms of target marketing, we contract with the chamber, and we have a good relationship with the chamber. Last year, they were successful in having 3 company locations. They generated 28 new jobs with 40 indirect new jobs. This had a capital investment of $1.36 million and an economic output of $21.5 million. In addition to the target marketing, we have an asset, and you were talking about how do we capitalize on an asset. We have an asset that's over 743 acres. That's the City San Angelo Business and Industrial Park that in essence had been inactive, perhaps. I don't know if that's the proper word, for many years. And we've been able to sell some of those assets, put companies in the industrial park that help to create jobs, and we sold several parcels. Last year alone, we sold 3 parcels in the industrial park. So
were those for new companies or companies moving from existing locations in San Angelo out there?
We have, I don't have these, I'd have to look more, but it was both. We have companies that purchased property at the peak or as we were in the recovery stages of the economy, and so they're waiting to build new facilities. So we have sold to those that are new companies, including FedEx, and then we have sold to existing companies who are obviously expanding there at the industrial park. Those are the 3 top areas. I can talk more about other things that we're doing, but I think that helps to answer your question.
You know, I look at this as one of the things that we have to constantly monitor and challenge, because as it relates to our ability to grow San Angelo and jobs and opportunities and new corporations, this is singularly the only area that has dedicated funds to do that. Obviously, our general fund and some of the areas that we have just talked about are all relative to available dollars, and we're always very tight on those things because we're not increasing enough in terms of sales tax dollars, property tax dollars relative to overall growth and development of the city. And here's the one area where those dollars exist. So it's a critical area for San Angelo relative to the future and relative to all budgeting issues that are made, because these are the dedicated funds that have to make sure it brings something to the table. And I know that many citizens have been critical of the Development Corporation some years back because so many funds went to areas and businesses that didn't bring anything to the table, but actually we lost due to bankruptcies, etc. So this area has to be constantly challenged and reviewed, because it is the dollars that have been put here that go towards this part of the business, not to the general fund. So they become critical dollars in terms of our growth and development. So we have to make sure that this is functioning to the highest level possible and the greatest strategic plan to ensure these dollars are well spent and bring what needs to happen in terms of economic growth and development.
I totally agree. I'd like to comment on the nature of our development corporation. It is very different from all other development corporations in the state of Texas. As you can see, the majority of the funds are ballot allocated. They go to water supplies and other quality of life projects. And so our funds are very limited. And the other unique piece about the economic development side of the Development Corporation is that we not only can utilize those dollars, and so this goes toward that strategic plan that you're talking about. Our program of work is very diversified. We work on areas that affect quality of life, for example, the parks and our City Hall Annex, and we look at infrastructure, so where we can influence additional businesses that can generate or locate the downtown area where the Development Corporation just recently made a commitment to. So we are very diversified in what we look at, and so those dollars are very spread out, so which in turn makes those dollars much more limited because we do spread the pie, so to speak. But we believe that in all those projects, they have to meet the spirit of the law, the criteria of the law to be able to qualify. However, it is very limited because we do sort of spread the wealth.
So when you say that in the economic development piece, you have $2.5 million that goes towards economic development versus the ballot initiatives here that are the $5,656,000, which are those water issues, those parks issues, those city annex issues. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying both. So on the ballot side, we were fulfilling some prior ballot projects that were on the, I guess, on a certain timetable. But on the economic development side, we not only can use it to target new industry and help existing businesses, but we can also use them for quality of life projects, which includes park-related improvements, the quality of life, the City Hall Annex improvements, where we help to supplement that project. So economic development by itself can do quality of life as well as primary job targeting and retention.
So you can break out quality of life dollars versus true economic development dollars?
Yes, we can.
Mayor, the ballot contained a requirement that the ballot project segment would be at least 20 or 72%.
That's correct.
And what that does is limit the economic development portion to no more than 28%. And that, I think, if you back away from a bigger picture perspective, is what he was alluding to earlier.
I agree. and that's my question is relative to the ballot initiatives, which are obviously detailed right there. But then when you get down to the economic development issue, those are, I'm interested in knowing ultimately quality of life dollars versus true economic development dollars, because I think we need to be aware of the difference between where we're investing in quality of life versus where we're spending monies for true economic development projects, because they're certainly different issues.
Yes, ma'am. I do want to point out as well, I don't know that Roland didn't mention this. When you look at the economic development amount, the $2.5 million, we do have competing economic development entities in other cities that surround us. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, Mayor, they have quite a bit more money than we do, so we have to be more creative with those dollars.
The reason I'm asking the question.
We have to be more creative with those dollars to get planned as far as moving forward. So absolutely, it's really difficult at times to provide those incentives to those companies that are looking at other areas. So yes, we have to do everything we can with what we have.
That's what
Yes.
That's the conversation I wanted to have.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Plan to discuss as far as major funds, revenue, and expenditures. Again, I do have that presentation regarding our property and sales tax analysis. I don't know if you're interested in a break or if you want to move right into that, or it's however you all want
a break?
proceed.
I see a lot of heads nodding
definitely.
yes for a break.
Okay.
We are on a break.
So we wanted to put together some information to try to kind of give an overview of how property tax and sales tax work together, and to give you an idea of where we stand with our existing sister cities and how we rank amongst those. And so that's what this presentation is about. First of all, why do we care about property valuation? Well, it's the key component of the property tax equation, which is the valuation, which is assessed by the appraisal district, times the tax rate, which is set by the city council, and that equals our tax levy, which is what we budget for property tax revenue on an annual basis. At the most, excuse me, because the valuation is determined independently, governing boards can decide the valuation or the tax rate, but not both. Okay? So our city's current property tax rate is 0.776 per $100 of assessed valuation. 0.6774 of that goes to maintenance and operations, and 0.0986 of that goes to interest and sinking fund, which is our debt service fund for the general debt service. Excuse me, our combined local rate is 2.5085 per $100 of assessed valuation. Of that, 0.776 obviously is the city of San Angelo. The county accounts for 0.5125 of that, and the school district is 1.22 of that amount. So you can see here that the combined local property tax rate, San Angelo the city accounts for 31%, while other entities account for 69% of our citizens' tax rate burden. This is the historical property tax rate for San Angelo. You can see there, I don't know if this is a pointer, but starting in 2005, we began slowly to decrease the tax rate on an annual basis. We flattened out there in about 2014, and we have neither increased the tax rate or changed it since that time. This is our general fund revenues by source. You can see there that the property tax accounts for 40% of our general fund revenue, while sales tax accounts for about 25% of that revenue. And then our expenditures by department. Our property tax was initially adopted into the charter, and the purpose of the property tax was to fund public safety. Well, you can see from 46% of our revenue being from property tax and 51% of our expenditures going toward police and fire, that property tax revenue that we do generate is not even enough to cover the cost of those services. And the next slide just shows our expenditures by category. 72% of our general fund expenditures go to personnel. And again, the majority of that goes to police and fire, police officers and fire personnel. This slide depicts our assessed valuation per capita. So you can see there in comparison with some of our sister cities, on average, the assessed value per capita for San Angelo is lower than most of them. I think Wichita Falls might be a little bit lower than San Angelo, but this just shows that per your average citizen, our assessed value is much lower than some of our sister cities. And so our property tax rate, again, going back to that equation, combined with our assessed value is where we produce our property tax revenue. And so for San Angelo, it has to be a little bit higher in order to generate the same amount of revenue that other cities are able to generate because their assessed values are so much higher. They have a much broader tax base. This is just a comparison of our property tax rate, again, with our sister Texas cities. Just same discussion that we had before. It's a little higher, but again, that's because of our smaller tax base. And so in order to generate the same amount of revenue and provide those services, we do need to have a bit of a higher tax rate. And you'll see more about that, again, like I said, when we discuss in further detail in correlation with the sales tax revenue. This is the amount of property tax revenue by city. So Midland is up there, of course. We're right in line with Odessa and Wichita Falls. I do want to point out that all of these numbers do come from audited financial statements from 2016. I did want to make sure that we had accurate and up-to-date numbers. So that was the most recent year that had been audited. So I want to point that out. That's where these numbers are coming from in this presentation. So this is our tax levy per capita. So this is the amount of tax each individual citizen would pay based on the amount of tax revenue that we receive for the city of San Angelo. It's $352 for San Angelo in comparison with the other cities, but ranging from $281 to $329. Another thing that we take into consideration when we're talking about the tax levy and tax levy comparisons are property tax exemptions, excuse me. So San Angelo's exemption is up to 20% of a home's value, or at least $5,000. Abilene's is 15% or $5,000. Wichita Falls is a flat $25,000. Odessa is 20% or $5,000. And in Midland, it depends on the value of your property and the location. And so San Angelo's homestead exemption of 20% also gives our citizens, some relief when it comes to their property tax bill as well. So to start on sales tax, our city rate is 0.015. Of that, 1 cent goes to the city and a half cent goes to the Economic Development Corporation. Our combined local rate is 8 1/4. So again, 1.5 cents going to the city of San Angelo and the Development Corporation, a half cent goes to the county, and of course 6 1/4 goes to the state of Texas. This is our sales tax revenue by city, again for fiscal year 16 audited financial statements. You can see how San Angelo is lagging quite a ways behind any of our sister cities when it comes to sales tax, and that in conjunction with the property tax is what we wanted to talk about today. Our sales tax revenue per capita is $1.70, again lagging quite a bit behind our sister cities when it comes to sales tax revenue. And then this is depicting our combined property and sales tax per capita. And you can see that we're kind of close for fiscal year 16 with Odessa and Wichita Falls, but we're still, even with the combined property tax and sales tax per capita, we still lag behind all of our sister cities when it comes to generating revenue for those two revenue streams. San Angelo was at $523 total per capita, Abilene at $570, Wichita Falls at $530, Odessa at $535, and Midland at $592 per capita. And so, again, we just wanted to kind of give an overview of how the property tax and sales tax work together, and to show that, while we are being very conservative, we still have to find other ways to generate that revenue to provide those services that our citizens have come to expect. And so with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions, to expand on any of that, provide more information if you have any questions on that.
Do you have what other cities in total have ours is 72%. Let me go back to that slide. For personnel, what do other cities, what percent? Because the big picture, of course, is the following conversation. We keep trying to do salary and pay relative to those cities, but if you take a look at them, we're not close to those cities. So you look at it and you go, okay, so 72% of our funds go towards personnel. What do those other cities' percent of personnel equal?
You know, that's not something that I've actually looked at in detail. I don't want to put Lisa on the spot, but she wouldn't know either. Okay. I could get that information for you, but.
So I mean, my big point is the fine. We can't use Midland, Odessa, Wichita Falls, and Abilene as comparison cities because we don't rank close to them in almost every category, particularly property tax. And so we just need to be cognizant of, it's nice to talk about Midland, Odessa relative to where we should be, but we're not close to where they are. I mean, they have double the amount of sales tax revenue we have. Double.
And Mayor, no, that's a good point. So you look at double the amount of sales tax revenues that they have, because they do have those additional numbers that come in. I mean, they really can afford to have a lower tax rate, property tax rate. So you start looking at that, and you see the challenges that the city of San Angelo has in combining those two, which are our top two revenue generators. We have to be more efficient with our monies, basically, what it comes down to. Mm-hmm.
We do.
Mm-hmm.
However, the reality is we do compete with those cities for employees.
We just wanted to, I did ask Tina to put this together. I just want to make sure that we're clear. As far as when we start talking about property taxes, sales tax revenues, I wanted to make sure that, and I'll be doing the same presentation on Thursday evening, but to another group that had asked for this. But on our part, we just want to make sure that we go into, especially our general fund, when we start discussing that item at the next budget workshop with our eyes wide open, and looking at exactly what those challenges are, and then addressing them accordingly. But again, I think this is a good presentation by Tina, good numbers you put together, so I appreciate you doing that.
I would like to say that, you know, sales tax is something that we have limited control over how much revenue we bring in. And so property tax is one of our biggest tools. It has to be, unfortunately. And if we did have the same sales tax per capita on the slide, as some of our sister cities, we would be generating a lot more revenue in that regard and be able to lower our property tax rate. And so that's why I know you've talked about it a lot, Mayor, about we need more industry, we need more commercial base, and that's very true. If we did have that additional source of income, we'd be able to lower, I mean, from the math that I've done, we could lower our tax rate anywhere from 9 to 18 cents. And so, you know, it's very important to keep up on that and to try to bring in those new industries and new revenue streams.
Thank you. It's a very important point.
Yeah.
That's what you have, Tina? Anything
Yes,
else?
sir.
All right. That is it, Mayor, council members. We want to thank you, of course, for participating in this workshop. We will have our next one 2 weeks from now, which we will go in depth into our general fund and our needs. We'll have some numbers, more definitive numbers, especially with sales tax revenues and property taxes, and that'll give us I guess a better idea of our forecasting and where we need to go from there. So again, we do thank y'all for spending this time with us, and we look forward to the next one.
Thank you. The meeting is adjourned at 10:57.